So today I wanted to talk about abuse addiction and specifically what craving looks like inside of that and relapse. And I almost wanted to touch on something more like specific to psychology first, just to kind of again relay why this kind of stuff occurs so that people can again understand better if they don't. I think there's lots of reasons and lots of factors. I know that there's plenty of people who probably did not have these types of childhoods going on in their childhoods necessarily. You didn't have the childhoods in your childhoods, yeah. Anyone can turn into an addict at any point in their life, no matter how good of a job mom and dad does. But at the same time, I think it's good to know and interesting to explore what causes these vulnerabilities in us as children, for people who are more vulnerable and are more susceptible to, I think, addiction in general and addiction to abuse and neglect. So I'm not going to go over everything this girl talks about in her video because she was very poignant, and I'm going to put a link to it in the description down below so you can watch the entire thing if you want. I'm not trying to like take all of her material, but she essentially goes into what she calls, our first earliest interactions with our caregivers and how that impacts our ability to regulate our own emotions based on how they taught us and helped us learn how to regulate our own emotions. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes. And then essentially from how they teach us to regulate our own emotions, we go on to mimic that internally and with others out in the world after that. And it's a very, very impactful first experience for us, whoever our earliest caregivers were. So there's 4 different attachment styles that can form based off of that, based off of our ability or our inability to regulate our own emotions. And I'm not going to go into all 4 of them. The video is very short. It's only 15 minutes. I think it totally deserves the views and the likes because that might be her business and how she makes some money. So if you want to watch that and show her some support, that would be awesome. But from the 4 that she listed, I know that I for sure am insecure anxious. And insecure anxious, what this looks like is basically that the caregiver responds to their needs first, their emotional needs first, and then the child second. And this is absolutely what both of my parents did, even after they got divorced, with all of us. And so in a lot of ways, we essentially became parents to ourselves, I think, is how I remember it when I was a child. And so that made receiving love feel very unpredictable, and that also me receiving help and knowing what to feel and how to process what I was feeling, that was all very unpredictable. It was completely based on if my parents were having a good day or a good moment where they then decided, okay, I'm in an okay place, so now I will help the child second. And so what that looks like when you go out into the world, that's your initial experience. When you move out into the world and you're continuing to mimic this with yourself and others, it means that I essentially was taught that I needed to make sure that other people are okay first emotionally so that I can receive love or I can receive help processing what I'm feeling second. I just sort of learned to assume that I would come second and that others would come first, and that it was almost a necessity to help them feel better, help them feel happy, so that I could be okay as well. It makes sense that that type of vulnerability would attract predators and narcissists and people who are more self-centered and want someone who's going to be essentially a type of caregiver to them. And a second thing she said that I think was significant is that you do this even when you're not okay. So it's not like I did it to, when I was in a really strong place, try and nurture them, even when I'm suffering, even when I'm really like hurting and I have like a huge amount of need inside of myself, the other person still even then comes first. There's almost a type of neglect that occurs. So I just wanted to explain that first because I find that very informative and interesting and helpful. It's another layer of what's going on in the childhood that affects us later as adults. So that was just the first thing that I wanted to touch on before I kind of go into what craving looks like and what relapse looks like in addiction to abuse. The other distinction that I wanted to make just in terms of abuse addiction is that usually, you have two addicts in that type of relationship typically, because I think narcissists, psychopaths, people under this category of emotionally regressed personality disorders, because they are regressed, and I can always explain that in another video, but anyway, so they usually are addicted to what I would call ego feeding and usually sex. And then, so that's them, they're an addict. And then the other person, from examining myself at least and what I see in my friends, it's usually us being addicted to love, attention, adrenaline, stimulation. I think it starts out as love when we're younger, that chemical release of dopamine when you're in love and in the honeymoon stage. But after you've been involved in abuse over and over and over again, I think that turns into addiction to adrenaline and stimulation and chaos over time, sort of tumbled around together in this definition of love that becomes very twisted and very morbid very quickly. So that's just how that, essentially that muscle that was already kind of strained becomes even more sort of feathered and fractured, I don't know. The muscle becomes more messed up over time. So the layer of this that's different than addiction to drugs or alcohol is that when someone is craving person, whether that be the person who's addicted to love and chaos, or the person who is addicted to sex and ego feeding, when they are craving that person, the person has the opportunity to say, no, I don't want to do this anymore, in a way that a substance or a piece of material like porn can't do. So it creates this added layer of manipulative behavior that's brought out of both people when the drug essentially says, I don't want to do this anymore, and has also the ability to physically walk away and leave. Sometimes the survivor is trying to leave, or the love addict is trying to leave because the abuse has become too much and the discarding has become too much. Or when the person addicted to sex or ego feeding says, no, I don't want to do this anymore, either to be manipulative, to cause distress, to gain power, or because they are discarding the person because they never cared about them in the first place and they found a better drug over here in a new person. For either of those reasons, whenever either person are saying, no, I don't want to do this anymore, there's the opportunity for really intense manipulative behavior to occur from either person in an attempt to get the drug to stay. That, I think, adds another crazy layer to this stuff, where you just get significant levels of abuse, stalking, I think, that can go on, the tactics for intimidation that are used, the tactics to try to attempt to regain the person's love. I mean, there's a lot of things that can occur, but it is really, honestly, like a child who's throwing a temper tantrum for something that they are used to receiving that they're now being told they won't receive anymore. And so that's just what I've noticed that makes this addiction almost like crazier sometimes and way more intense and way more volatile than these other ones, is because of that added layer. So with those cravings, the other aspect I wanted to discuss was what that kind of looks like when you're detoxing. So if for people who haven't been in Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, any of those groups, I only know about Alcoholics Anonymous specifically, but I saw people, when you're chemically detoxing from something, that is sometimes almost a very dangerous thing that's going on in your body. Like, for example, with alcoholics, they have to actually be monitored if it's severe enough, because they could die from the crash that's going on. And even with antidepressants and stuff that provide that serotonin just like, you know, some of these abusive relationships do. There can be a really intense detox process to just cold turkey cutting off antidepressants as well. I know one of my friends, her father had been on this antidepressant at a fairly high dose for years, and then he cold turkey stopped taking it, and he actually started hallucinating from the lack of serotonin in his brain not knowing how to compensate from that unexpected crash going on. So a lot of these detoxes, for that reason, can be very dangerous and very risky. And I think the same is absolutely true when you're detoxing from an abuser, not necessarily for that reason, for the physical risk that might be involved of, you know, the chemicals inside of you that are crashing from the lack of dopamine and everything else. But I will say that there's risk involved when there's the risk of you going back to the drug because you can't handle what you're feeling inside. And I see that a lot. I felt that myself, where I thought because I was feeling so sad about them and it felt so good when we got back together, that must mean that we're soulmates. Or there were times where I really just couldn't even handle the depression that I was feeling. It was that intense. It felt that overwhelming, and that caused me to go back to them. There's lots of different reasons, but either way, that is more so the risk that's involved when someone's considering leaving an abuser or an abusive situation and they start having those cravings. And so in lieu of that, one thing that people do, again, using alcohol, for example, is when people are detoxing off of alcohol, they will eat chocolate. They will eat a lot of sugar in food form, because one thing that their body's having trouble regulating is that loss of sugar that's going on. And so, you know, it's this temporary engagement and something that might not be super healthy for you, but it's the less horrible thing to turn to versus the thing that you're addicted to. Because obviously people can get addicted to sugar. They can, you know, there's a whole group for people who are addicted to food. So here you are turning to something that's less horrible, that you're not addicted to, that isn't healthy necessarily, while you're detoxing and craving a thing that could possibly kill you. So you don't go back to that instead. And so with girls who are leaving men, this is one thing that, like, I've told girls before, where I'm like, you know, you're going to notice that you're engaging in like really crazy, reckless behavior. And I don't condone any of that. I don't even condone it in myself. It's something that I wrestle with and I fight with tooth and nail every single time. But just understand why that's happening. Don't attach self-blame to it. Don't personalize it, and so that you feel like a failure, like you think you're abnormal. You're not abnormal. There is something chemically going on inside of you. There is a significant lack of dopamine happening, and that causes our brain to scramble and try to find another source. And so a lot of times, since the man or the woman or whatever, since the person has been the source of dopamine, that causes us to go out and look for other sources of dopamine in other people. And a lot of times what happens is, by the grace of God, we can't find someone who's as abusive and who provides as high of a honeymoon stage as that other manipulative predator did. And so because they can't provide a honeymoon stage that gives us that hit of dopamine or serotonin that's as high as it was over here, we end up going back to our abuser who can provide that for us. Because every time you go back, there's that glimpse of the honeymoon stage again. They give you a little flash of it where it's all lovely, it's all wonderful, before it's all going to come crashing down again. And that is a really significant thing that happens when people are trying to leave an unhealthy situation. And I don't think everyone's, both the survivor or family and friends, I don't think a lot of people know, like, why are they acting so crazy? Aren't they so, like, they should be glad that they just left that unhealthy person. And it's like, look, bro, they don't even know, like, up from down right now. Like, they are chemically, not insane, but they're chemically discombobulated on a significant level. I think what makes this incredibly vulnerable, though, and where I see the spiritual aspect to this stuff, is that regardless of my chemical discombobulation going on, the things that will be brought into my life to tempt me is so creepy. And also the ways that I almost sometimes will feel like I'm getting tortured and punished spiritually for trying to break a connection to a dark thing that I became spiritually connected to. I've seen that happen not just to myself, but so many other people who have made a promise and a commitment to either leave a dark spiritual situation through abuse or a dark spiritual situation through addiction, drugs, alcohol, all that stuff. And in both scenarios, I've seen how people, sometimes the worst things happen to them during that period of time when they're trying to break free. And it really looks, after you see it happen enough and you can start seeing the patterns to that cycle, it really starts to look like a person who's getting tortured and punished for trying to leave something that doesn't want to break its hold on them. But anyway, so I didn't fully finish that thought, but what I was going to say is obviously I don't feel comfortable telling people how to approach. I'm not a doctor, and so much of this is spiritual and is so complicated, especially when it's abuse addiction specifically. But just understand that you sometimes have to supplement the dopamine. And that doesn't mean you need to, like, again, find a man to supplement the dopamine. I'm just saying, understand that supplementing your dopamine, there's lots of things that can provide dopamine. It's not just relationships, but we don't know that because we've only learned how to try to receive it from one source. We've been trained for so long to receive it from one type of source. So to figure out how to receive dopamine in different ways outside of people is so significant. And if you're a friend or a family member to someone who's in an abusive situation and they're struggling with leaving them, just know that sometimes just hanging out with them, while I'm not diminishing that as significant and important, but just know you're probably not providing them dopamine. And so if they seem dissatisfied with that after a while, if it seems like they don't really want to hang out with you and they're kind of apathetic to hanging out and connecting, it's not personal. It's because they need dopamine right now. And so for them to have help or on their own, I think it's very important a lot of times for the people to figure things out on their own. If on their own, through the grace of God, they can figure out how to receive dopamine in a different way, that really could help a person stay sober and stay away from their abuser longer. I would say adrenaline is another thing that the brain's seeking, but more so probably dopamine. But adrenaline probably is another component to that from what I've felt inside when I try to assess what I'm craving. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about was just this aspect of actual relapse. Just like the addiction portion is different, because we are people, we're not substances or pieces of material like porn, and because we can be interacted with and things. Relapse looks different on drugs and alcohol versus relapse on a person. And it's interesting because actually I think the relapse process almost has more hope involved in it, in relapse to a person, than there is. I don't know. It just depends on the situation. I don't want to speak in too much of a blanket term, but I'll speak from my own experience. In my own experience, when I am starting to leave an abuser, that very first time that I leave them, even if it's only for a day, even if it's only for a week, it's like what I would compare it to is almost you've been in this prison this whole time, right? It's almost like a version of like hypnosis. It's like all you've seen, all you've known. You slowly became desensitized to all this inappropriate, horrible behavior, and you're in this fog, you're in this cloud. You've forgotten what the real world looks like, feels like. You've forgotten those things. And when you leave them, even for a day, even for any short period of time, because it's usually very, very brief the first time, when I have left them, sorry, I need to speak for myself. When I have left them, you get a taste of the real world again. It's like you're stepping outside of that fog, outside of that cloud, and you see the things that you forgot. You feel the emotions that you haven't, usually freedom, a sense of relief from knowing that you're going to be away from it before all the fear begins and the craving and the self-doubt and everything, before all that stuff happens, there's just this immense relief and this feeling of freedom. And that would be so significant for me. And I would get a taste again of the world that I had missed, so that when I went back to them, and it does take a couple of times usually for myself, when I go back to them, my mind cannot forget that. It leaves an impression, always. So that even when I go back, there is an added layer of misery and discontentment that none of their hypnosis through their words, none of their love bombing and honeymoon stage manipulative tactics can make me forget, can make my spirit forget. Because I got a taste of something that was richer, that my soul was thirsty for, that I didn't even know that I was thirsty for until I tasted it. And my soul will continue to yearn for that. And eventually, who knows what amount of time, sometimes it's years. It's not always months. Sometimes it's years that I would stay with that person again but that misery was still there. I did not forget. And eventually I would gain the courage to leave again. And at least in my cycles of abuse, every time that what started out was how long it was that I left them was very, very short, and how long we stayed together when I came back was very long. But over time, that started to flip-flop to where the periods of time that we broke up were very, very long, and the periods of time that we stayed together when I came back were very, very short. And if you know anyone who is in an abusive relationship and they're at that last period where their get back together points are very short, for me, when that happens to me, there is hope in that. I cannot speak for everyone. I cannot speak for every situation. There's no way to calculate. There's no determined amount of attempts that it takes. Like, oh, once you get to 10, you're done. The relationship always ends after 10 attempts to leave. Some people, it could take 25 or 30 tries. I don't know. For me, I figure things out fairly quickly. I see patterns to things, and it only ever usually took me about 7 to 8 tries. And I think statistically it says the minimum is 7. So I was like, statistically accurate, woohoo. Yeah, but I just want people to know that, and I've seen that with my friends, not that it takes 7 tries, but that when they're getting towards the end of that relationship, it starts to become shorter and shorter blips of being together. And that always gives me hope for them. I don't let my hope get too high, because the other thing that I see family and friends struggle with, and this isn't like shame towards anyone, but we tend to personalize things. I think that's just a human temptation, especially once you've given someone advice or feedback and you feel like it went really well, right? They heard you, we bonded, they got it, we got it, success everywhere. And then you get attached. You get attached to their story because it feels like you contributed something, and you want to see what they do with your contribution, with your guidance, with your helpfulness. It feels like a piece of you is now in their story, but it's still not about us when we do that. And it's not that your contribution didn't matter. It's not that they didn't hear what you were saying, but there's more people involved in this than just us when we're trying to help someone. And a lot of times it's someone with a lot of charisma, a lot of manipulative sway, a person who is deeply embedded in the eventual survivor's mind. They have a strong hold on that mind. And you are like this big sometimes. If God's plan for them is different, sometimes you're this big compared to something that's that big, or like that. And so it's not personal. But if you can stick with them and work on not personalizing their journey, work on accepting them in their relapses to something horribly toxic, try to really understand the whys of why they're doing things, so that you can almost help them better whenever they want your help. And that's the other thing. Sometimes they're not going to want your help. That doesn't mean that you aren't valuable as a person, okay? Not everybody wants our help all the time, guys. It's okay. But yeah, there eventually will be a last time. And what an amazing journey to go on with someone, to be there to celebrate with them their success when they finally stop relapsing and start, hopefully, their journey towards healing their addiction to some really, really bad stuff. So anyway, I'm hoping maybe this video was helpful. It was just something I was thinking about this week, and it's a journey. You know, any addiction is a journey. So if you want to comment down below with any thoughts that you have, feel free to, and thanks again for watching.